Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about the idea of the virtual self and the virtual world and how that has caused great damage to our society. And something I see all the time in the university setting, and then it gets pushed out into the real world, and we've seen it over the past 20 years really start to trickle in and create problems. So I want to talk about those kind of things today. But first, if you haven't done yet, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I'd appreciate that and help you be notified of new postings that come every day. And then also, I hope that you would tell a friend as well. So let's dig in. So the idea of the virtual self is not a new thing. It's been studied in communication scholarship for quite a while now because we've frankly moved so much of our lives into the virtual world. When the internet first came about, everyone started talking about how wonderful it was going to be able to do things and collaborate with people all over the world, thinking that we're going to have like this concept of our normal selves would just be able to reach out and talk to other people, just like with the telephone. You know, those of you who are old enough remember the old jingle to reach out and touch someone for AT&T when they were always pushing their phone service. So the idea of just being able to reach out beyond just our physical selves, just to reach out on the phone line and get a hold of somebody that might be a town over or a state over or a country over. Well, we move into the virtual, into the internet world, and we kind of thought the same thing. It's just another way to reach out and touch somebody. Well, we started to find out more and more that as you go into these online, use an online tool, you can create online spaces. And you start seeing that kind of grow. And of course, one of the first major social media platforms was MySpace, which again, there's your term right there. It's my space. So in other words, it's no longer a thing where, look, I am a member of the actual human world and I'm just using this tool to reach out to other people. I'm not going to create my own space where I will get to live and set up things how I would like them. And at first it's like, oh, this is no big deal. It's just like setting up your bedroom in your house. I'm going to decorate it the way I want it. And it'll be my own personal space where I can go and sit and hang out. Until we started seeing in the scholarship more and more people starting to spend inordinate amount of times in space and spending more time, in that space. And looking at the idea of how I can change it and shift it and manage it and all that kind of stuff far more than you would do in your normal bedroom. So this becomes a bigger deal, and that's when people started noticing things are changing. And even look at Facebook, the way it started. It started initially, here's how we can use this online platform to reach out with other people to find out where the parties are. And that's how it's all set up. And then it turned into more of a place to reside. And you'd set up all these different Facebook groups, and you'd spend your time in the groups just sitting in those groups, talking with those people in those groups and getting to know them. And, it's not just social media platforms. Of course, you had different online forums and listservs and things like that where people were spending time doing their thing. So again, it's not just to bash social media. It's one of those things that it's been an evolution. That's the point of this part of the conversation. So we see that kind of shift happen. Now, the big problem we start seeing also is we start seeing a conflict with our own human nature. I mentioned this before in a previous podcast. We are social and political animals, according to Aristotle. And what that means is we're not meant to be alone. And this is not some revelation of Aristotle. I mean, he just happened to notice it. But you go back in Scripture, when at the creation of woman, God looked at man and said, it is not good for man to be alone. So we're not supposed to be alone. We're supposed to be live in a way that we have interaction with other people. So that's what Aristotle means by being a social animal. So when he looks at the idea of being a political animal, he doesn't mean like, we need to be Republicans and Democrats. This is ancient Greece after all. He's looking more at the concept of the polis, living in the community. So that's where we get politics from, the polis. So we have this organized community, and the important part of that is that it's organized. It's not that it's just a situation of people just hanging out in the same room. It's that we're together and we have to figure out how to live together. That's where we get our concept of politics. How do we live together? How do we set up laws? How do we set up structure, command and control, all that kind of stuff like that, to figure out who determines what. So we are a social animal. We're social animals. We are political animals, and we need to and we find meaning and joy by being in the polis. We aren't meant to be alone. So you can kind of see where we're going here with the problem, because when we move into the online space, we start trumpeting this concept of social media, which again, media is a plural form of medium. Medium, again, go back to the ancient languages, and medium is basically, we get the idea of medias, something that's in between. So we have something that's in between us. So this right here, what we're doing here, this is the medium of a camera. That's the one thing. So we're using that piece of tool that gets this message delivered, but it's through the medium of YouTube. So this is being delivered through YouTube, through your internet browser, and here it comes. So that's the whole idea of this, and it's in between us. I am not talking to you. You're not talking to me. There is something in between, and so this is asynchronous. So I'm creating this at a certain day and time. You're watching it at another certain day and time, and so it's just not the same. So we're not synchronous. We're asynchronous. We're now shifted apart. So that's the big problem. As soon as you have a medium, we're now shifted apart. So then you tag the word social onto it, and that denotes that we're gathering and sharing and all that good fun stuff. You can't be social and have something in between you. So social media is kind of a misnomer. It's a false term. It doesn't make sense, because you can't be social and have something in between you. So that's the inherent problem with social media platforms. So you can start seeing this issue. So now we have a divorce. So there's the real world, and then there's the virtual world, and that's the basis of today's topic. So in the real world, you have all the people that you bump into at Walmart, the grocery store, when you're walking around town, doing whatever the kind of thing you're doing. Those are real world, the people you're at work with, in class with, that kind of stuff. And then there's the virtual world. That's anyone else that's in that space. So you can see the issue at hand. We've already now divorced ourselves and have two. Now, sometimes there might be crossover. You might have, had a situation where you're friends with somebody in real life, and you're also friends on social media, and that's a real thing that happens as well. And it creates, of course, a weird dynamic that way, because, at first we think this is a good thing, because like my relatives in Tennessee, I don't get to see very often, but I can be friends with them on Facebook or whatever and catch up with them. So I'm in this virtual world where I can catch up with them. But again, there's a thing in between us. And also you introduce time and space, that becomes a real problem. And then now, my interaction with them is not as sincere. It's not as genuine. It's not as real. So this real space allows for all of our senses to work. It allows us to have good, real, rich conversation. This is much more shallow, and it's delayed by time. So if I ask a question, I might get a response within 20 seconds. I might get a response in 20 days. So that conversation is greatly hampered by that kind of delay. So you start seeing this definite change. But also think about how I act in this real world. I act as a human being, as a social being, a social critter, who wants to get to know people. We can do every sense, obviously not taste, unless of course you're kissing. Of course, then taste comes into play. But otherwise, you're seeing, you're touching. Even if it's just a handshake or a fist bump, it's still touching. So you're smelling, you're seeing, you're hearing. All your senses are at play in this kind of this real interpersonal communication. Think how much deeper that communication happens to be then, because all your senses are involved, and you tend to be more attached to that. And there's also no time delay. It's a synchronous communication. I ask a question, I see a response on your face. Then you open your mouth and talk, and I hear your response, and vice versa. And we have that kind of conversation. As soon as I shift over here to the virtual world, a lot of that gets cut off, and now I'm talking in a different way. I might say the same words, but it comes out totally differently because you're not hearing it. And even if we're doing a video chat, you're still missing out some things. There's no smell, there's no touch, no taste. You have all those things that are gone, and it changes fundamentally. The conversation. It's just like if you took all the doors off your car and the windshields and the trunk off and things like that. Well, it's still a car. It's like, well, but it's missing fundamental parts, and the drive is going to be different. It's going to be much windier and colder as you're driving down the road. So it's just one of those things where it's not the same. So that's a problem that we have. And as a result, we see is divorce from reality, because reality is all of our senses. So we have, the real thing, and then we have the virtual thing. And even like in gaming, they try to cheat you on this by calling it virtual reality. Well, it's not, really there. They try to do things like if you have video game controllers with haptic abilities where like they'll have like vibration controls and things like that. I mean, yeah, that's part of it, but it's not real. It's just a simulation. And of course you don't have smell and you don't have taste. So those things are still gone in a virtual reality world. But we have this divorce from reality, and as a result, we don't know exactly how to act, how to behave, and how to treat one another. And it has an effect on us. So this is where I get to the concept of the virtual self. So the idea of the virtual self is something, again, it's been studied for 20, 30 years in communication scholarship. And it's the idea that you and your real life person, your virtual person, your real life person are not the same people. And what happens in your virtual world does trickle into your real world and alters you this way. Very few people are the same people in both spaces. Like what you see here and what you see here are the same. They're just not. Because one, obviously you're getting rid of all those senses. So if you're like a hardworking person, physical labor, and at the end of the day, you smell from working, you're going to miss all that. Like, no, I'm the same guy online. You can't import smell. You can't see that. If you're a huggy kind of person, you love giving hugs. Well, online, you can't do that. So people, they're going to miss that key component of who you are. So you're going to have a divorce from that. That was one of the problems with COVID. Whenever we had everyone separated, the idea of like not being able to touch was a very hard thing for a lot of people. So if you like giving hugs, I'm a handshake guy. So like, no, you can't give handshakes anymore. It's like, but that's a part of who I am. I want to be able to give you a handshake. You can't do that. So in the virtual world, you can't do that. So that's going to change who I am as a virtual self. Then I start interacting with other virtual selves, and they're not the same as who they are. And it changes the way we behave. Now, it changes it a lot of times for the worse, because I can say things online without repercussion. In real world, if I say something crass to you, you might punch me in the nose. That would be a problem. In the virtual world, I'm not going to get found. In fact, I could be one of 8 billion people in the world. Good luck. So you start developing this digital mouth, and you start developing these digital muscles, what I called e-muscles in my dissertation for my doctorate. You have these that you would not normally have or show off in the real world, but you have them online. And other people do the same. So again, when I was in high school, if you said something and you could get pushed into a locker, and you could have a problem that way. And next thing you have an actual fight. There's repercussions for what you say. And the school tried to crack down on bullying, but all it did was move us off the school campus. So like there's a Dairy Queen next door. So as soon as you step over the little wire rope fence that they had around the school property and you step there, the school can't touch you. So after school, instead of fighting in the parking lot, you fight in the back of the Dairy Queen parking lot. No big deal. They tried to break that up, but people are going to fight over things they said, over territory, over that kind of stuff. It's been that way since the dawn of time. Now you move to the virtual world. Well, where are the restraints? Well, sure, there's no touch, so I can't physically hit you. So how do I hit you? Introducing cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is a fairly new term because, well, we just had good old-fashioned bullying. In good old-fashioned bullying, if you had a bully, you and your friends could gang up and teach the bully a lesson. In cyberbullying, they can go on and on and on, and a lot of times you don't even know who it is. The message just goes out, and especially like if like on Facebook, you usually have your name, but like you go into X, what's your handle? You go into Instagram, what's your handle? Go to TikTok, what's your handle? And like could be anybody. I mean, you could just be like, dude 123. Like, well, who's that? So it's just, you could easily bully people, and you could say awful things, and there's pretty much no repercussion. And because just being mean to people doesn't violate terms of service typically, you could do it just absolutely free and clear. When you get down to actual death threats, again, you'd think terms of service would kick in, but there's so much of that happens, it doesn't get regulated very well. So you have absolutely vile, awful stuff being said in this virtual world. Think what that does to a person. Now, even if you're like rough and tumble, no one likes getting that kind of barrage. But if you're actually more susceptible to that kind of a thing, think how crushing that actually is. So this divorce from reality creates a lot of problems, and to the point where people start, also in this virtual world, start creating their own quote unquote safe space. So in the real world, people who don't like to be picked on, you can walk away and find a new place to go. And that's, your little safe space that you created here. But at the end of the day, you can still wander into, dangerous areas in real life, because you kind of have to. You have to go to the grocery store. You have to go to Walmart. You have to go wherever. But over here in the virtual world, you can kind of choose where you go. It's like pick your own adventure, and then never leave it. And you can set up everything to where you're totally comfortable, where you don't have any kind of abuse happening to you, where you don't have any kind of repercussions for your own actions. And you can start seeing how bad this can become, because now you start thinking of this world as this ideal, because nothing wrong happens to you. So even if you do something wrong, nothing happens to you. And if someone does something, you can choose and find a place where no one does anything bad to you. So there's nothing, it's an idealized world where everything is rosy. You can get away and do what you want. Who wouldn't want to live there? I mean, like over here, if I don't want to be picked on and I don't want to be in trouble when I do something wrong, that doesn't sound like fun, but this place I can curate it and make it so everything is perfect and lovely and wonderful. And it's no longer true. It's no longer a good place to be mentally. So you look at us and how we think about, who we are. You have the idea of who we think we are, who we feel we are, the idea of self-concept. So that's how I think I am. So, I'm a professor. I'm a man, and I start going down all these lists of things that I definitely am, and then I move into the self-esteem world. That's how I feel. Like, how do I feel about who I am? So in the real world, I am stuck with the boundaries of self-concept of what I actually am. In a virtual world, I can be anything. It's probably one of the main reasons why we see so many issues today with things like gender identity, because I'm trying to take this imaginary world where I can be anything I want and move it into the real world of ones and twos, pluses and minuses, man and woman, and I just want to move this imaginary into the real, and you see all kinds of problems from that kind of thing. Here is where I can shift and change and mold and do anything. I could be an astronaut, I could be a lion tamer. I can do anything I want in this virtual world that I can't do in this real world. So that self-concept causes a greater divorce. And then think how that makes you feel. I'm strong, I'm talented, I'm brave, I'm wealthy, I'm everything, and I think of all the things, how I feel about myself, and that changes here. Then I go out into this real world and find out actually I'm not those things at all. So I can go back and shelter myself even more into this world. And so you can see the great danger that can happen in this divorce from reality. And so where you end up seeing this is just the basic interaction that people have. I can spot a homeschooler miles away because they have eye contact. They can talk with you because a lot of homeschoolers aren't shoved off and live in this world. They used to be considered the socially awkward people because they wouldn't interact with people. Well, the real world, people aren't interacting with each other that much anyway. It's all a virtual thing, and it's an ugly place, with all the cyberbullying and other things that are going on there. And it's also a fraudulent place, the way that you make up things about yourself and everything in there. So that's not real. So if you're forced to live in a real grounded area, like even within the confines of a family, or the play groups and hangouts that you have with other homeschoolers and co-ops, there's forced interaction. So there's, eye to eye, there's conflict resolution, there's all the other stuff that goes on in real world that they don't learn in the virtual world. So it used to be that, again, homeschoolers were the socially awkward ones. Now they're the ones who are the most stable that I ever come across as students. The ones who won't look at me, the ones who, absolutely can't verbalize what they think or feel or anything like that, they're the ones who live in the virtual world almost exclusively. And the more they retreat to that, the more it's obvious that they can't function in society. That's at the college level. So imagine when they graduate, what's going to happen when they get into the real world. So you can see this kind of a problem. So I want you to be thinking about, after we have this little introduction to this idea of the virtual world, virtual self, think about, how am I spending my time? How about my kids or my grandkids or nieces, nephews, friends, whatever? How are they spending their time? And, I'm not saying, being online is an awful thing. Social media is terrible. I'm saying, we have to realize that there are two different spaces, and we have to realize how they should be treated, and it should be respected. Just like I don't want to be punched in the face by a bully over here. I don't want to set myself up to a false reality over here, because that's just as damaging, if not more, because this is damaging to my psyche, not just to my face. So be thinking about those kind of things as you interact today and figure out, okay, why am I spending so much time here? Why am I trying to hide from here? How can I get to here and spend more time and be realistic here? So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will catch you again next time on Communicology.